I'm Dr. Nathaniel Chin, and you're listening to Dementia Matters, a podcast about Alzheimer's disease. Dementia Matters is a production of the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Our goal is to educate listeners on the latest news in Alzheimer's disease research and caregiver strategies. Thanks for joining us. This episode is approved for continuing education credits for physicians, physician assistants, nurses, and other members of the healthcare team through the Interprofessional Continuing Education Partnership at UW-Madison. At the time of this recording, Dr. Brad Boeve discloses the following relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies. He is a consultant with TAL Consortium and discloses grants with Cognition Therapeutics, Elector, EIP Pharma, and Transposon Therapeutics. I, Dr. Nathaniel Chin, have the following relevant financial relationships with the ineligible companies as a consultant: New Amsterdam Pharma and Eli Lilly and Company. Information on how to claim credit will be shared at the end of this episode. Additional continuing education information is provided in the show notes. Welcome back to Dementia Matters. Today I'm joined by Dr. Brad Boeve. Dr. Boeve is a neurologist within Mayo Clinic's Department of Neurology and Center for Sleep Medicine, and a professor of neurology in the Division of Behavioral Neurology, as well as the co-director of the Mayo Clinic Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Dr. Boeve is a principal investigator of the ARTFL-LEFFTDS, Longitudinal Frontotemporal Lobar Degeneration, or ALLFTD, research study, which aims to further our understanding of frontotemporal lobar degeneration, or FTLD, by collecting data from patients to identify clinical measurements and biomarkers that can be used to follow patients during treatment trials and help predict when someone at risk of FTLD will start experiencing symptoms. Dr. Boeve joins us today to discuss frontotemporal dementia and the clinical evaluation process, as well as his research with the ALLFTD study. Dr. Boeve, welcome to Dementia Matters.
Oh, thanks so much, Nate. And I'll define what ALLFTD is, perhaps in a few minutes.
Okay, and that was a mouthful for me, so I appreciate it if you do. Before we discuss the research, though, I'd like to start by tapping into your clinical expertise. So could you share with our listeners what exactly is frontotemporal lobar degeneration, also known as FTLD, and do we know what causes it?
Yes, FTLD is an umbrella term that represents basically the third most common constellation of neurodegenerative syndromes, with Alzheimer's disease being the most common, Lewy body dementia or Lewy body disease, if you include Parkinson's disease under that umbrella too, and then FTLD, which is somewhere in the 5 to 15% of all neurodegenerative syndromes. And most individuals with FTLD, they develop symptoms younger than age 65, and 65 isn't any specific cutoff, but it's largely an early onset group of disorders. And in that setting, it's as common as Alzheimer's disease in that age range. So in younger folks, it is relatively common to the extent that early onset Alzheimer's disease is relatively common, but I wouldn't say either is common.
Right, but in my practice, of course, as a geriatrician of 65 and older, we just simply don't see that much FTD. And, in Alzheimer's, of course, we know that amyloid and tau are, that's at least the biological part of the process. And we're starting to understand what causes some of those proteins to at least accumulate. Well, what about with FTLD? Is there a particular cause or gene that's related to this?
Yes, and it's quite complicated, even for those who do this for a living, to be honest. So under the FTLD umbrella, the two most common proteinopathies, or the primary protein that's driving the symptoms, is either tau, and it's a different form of tau, but still the basic tau protein, or TDP43. And it's typically either or. Less commonly, there's the FET proteins, and again, it gets quite complicated with all of the proteins in the nomenclature. And I should also say, under the FTLD umbrella, there's behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, FTD with motor neuron disease or with ALS, primary progressive aphasia, and then corticobasal syndrome, and progressive supranuclear palsy or Richardson syndrome is also under that umbrella. And depending on the syndrome, that reflects the topography of degeneration in the central nervous system. And there's certain syndromes that have a predilection for a particular proteinopathy, tau versus TDP43. But as I'm sure we'll talk about, we don't have a perfect ability to detect the underlying protein unless we know a genetic cause. And the genetic cause is somewhere in the 20 to 40% of all individuals with an FTLD spectrum disorder will have a genetic contribution. Under that, a large percentage of them have a single mutation in a pathogenic gene. So it's much more genetically driven than Alzheimer's disease. At least, ApoE, we know quite a bit about that in Alzheimer's disease, but the pathogenic mutations are that much more of an issue in FTLD.
Wow, that does sound really complicated, Brad. And so genes are important, and it can even be a single mutation, but then there's TDP43, which is a protein, there's tau, which is different than the tau we think of with Alzheimer's disease, but still part of that tau protein complex. And then there's multiple different syndromes within it. And so, I'm emphasizing this to our listeners because I'm going to ask you the next question, and you might have to give me a couple of answers so that each syndrome gets a little bit of attention. And that's because really, what are the symptoms of FTLD? And maybe it's just you have to break it by the syndrome, and how are they different than Alzheimer's? Because sometimes the language part can overlap.
Yeah, and this underscores the challenges that we have as clinicians. We really need biomarkers, and we're still not quite where we want to be for biomarkers in the FTLD area, but we expect that to change quite a bit over the next few years. But in behavioral variant FTD, the symptoms are largely personality or behavioral change, executive dysfunction, language dysfunction. In the classic sense, memory is relatively preserved, but as we're seeing more and more people with BVFTD, they do have some degree of memory impairment. And so it really underscores the challenges differentiating between Alzheimer's disease. And then in BVFTD, roughly half will have a primary tau disorder, roughly half will have TDP43. Those are probably more on the order of 45% each, and then 5 to 10% even rarer proteins. And then in primary progressive aphasia, there's three variants. Some would argue more than three, but the three main variants: semantic variant primary progressive aphasia primarily affects the anterior temporal lobe in the dominant hemisphere. And so there's especially dysnomia, difficulty coming up with names of people or things. Now, this is very common in the population. And so, a lot of people are worried about this because so many of us are in a social setting. Oh, what is that person's name? This is a consistent dysnomia, and that's largely a TDP 43 disorder. Contrast that with the non-fluent agrammatic variant of PPA, where speech hesitancy, agrammatism, the fluency is affected, and that's more often a tau related disorder, not always, but largely a tau disorder. And then the so-called logopenic variant is kind of complicated to describe, but there's a lot of working memory issues as well as language, and that's often atypical Alzheimer's disease, underlying logopenic variant PPA. And then corticobasal syndrome, we used to use the term corticobasal degeneration, but we know about half of the people with corticobasal syndrome don't have corticobasal degeneration as the cause. And so that's why we use the syndromic term. And many of them have a primary tauopathy, but some can have atypical Alzheimer's disease, even though cognition is largely preserved, at least early on, and it seemed to be more of a motor phenotype. And then the classic progressive supranuclear palsy or Richardson syndrome, that's usually a tau related disorder.
Brad, I can't imagine being at one of your conferences and meetings and communicating among the experts. I mean, you have to be very clear about what you're talking about when you're describing this umbrella and all the different syndromes.
It is, and the same as in manuscripts. And imagine it's challenging for those who do this for a living or other healthcare professionals. Imagine if you're a patient or family member trying to decipher this. It really is a challenge.
And one thing I'm not going to ask you to talk about is the late limbic predominant age-related TDP-43 encephalopathy, because one of your colleagues, our colleagues, Dr. Wolk, has already done that on the podcast, and we'll put that episode in the show notes. So I won't ask you to speak to that TDP-43 issue. But when it comes to FTLD, can you diagnose this in that stage of mild cognitive impairment, or is this usually a condition that's diagnosed in the dementia stage?
With sporadic BVFTD, it's almost always by the time that a person's recognized to have FTD, they have a mild dementia syndrome. And now that's getting better with the circle of clinicians across the country, if not the world. We are getting better at identifying people early, but we call this the diagnostic odyssey of FTD. It can take 1 to 4 years before a person is diagnosed. And it's understandable if somebody's in their 30s or 40s, atypical depression or late life schizophrenia, for lack of a better term, or midlife crisis or bipolar disorder. And these are appropriate considerations based on a lot of the symptoms that are happening. It's only when they don't respond to treatment or some other things are, oh boy, this is way out of character for this individual. And then usually an imaging study, an MRI, or an FTG PET, a glucose PET scan. Sometimes an MRI can look more normal than not, and an FTG PET is usually abnormal, but not always. And so it again underscores the challenges with establishing a diagnosis. We still don't have good blood or CSF markers, and we still don't have good molecular PET imaging studies, although we anticipate in the next 5 years that's going to change for a more specific 4-repeat tau, maybe even a 3-repeat tau ligand, and then a TDP ligand.
And how about the language version of FTLD? You can diagnose that in MCI?
Yes. Again, if it's the clinician who can identify individuals, and this sometimes gets a little bit hairy in terms of, is this MCI of the language type, or is this very early PPA? That is a little bit semantics, even in semantic PPA, to be honest. But the main point is it's a language disorder, whether it's more fluent or non-fluent, to use the classic basic terms in aphasia. We often will hear about, well, somebody was told that they had a stroke, but we can't see it on the MRI scan. Well, that obviously doesn't make sense. So there's either a stroke or there isn't. But that's pretty common when it evolves insidiously and progressively worsens, not acutely, and so it just it sounds degenerative.
And so do people with FTLD, do they progress faster than those with Alzheimer's or Lewy body or vascular dementia?
You always hate this answer. It depends, but it really does. Anyone with any of these syndromes, along with coexisting ALS, then, as one would expect, the rate of progression is unfortunately fairly fast. But that's relatively uncommon. And there are some with BVFTD that from onset until death, it could be 2 to 3 years. I know of some, and I'm still following some, either sporadic or familial, and they can have symptoms 30 or 40 years, very slowly progressive, amazingly slowly progressive. That's less the case with corticobasal and PSP. Those syndromes, it's usually 5 to 10 years. But PPA and some variants of BVFTD can be extremely slow.
And I'll just ask you for those two, the behavioral variant, BV, and then the semantic version. How does a clinician diagnose those? How, when we refer to you as a specialist, what process do you go through, or what would you recommend primary care doctors be thinking about and patients be thinking about? And then you already mentioned this, but there's just no biomarkers, and unless you, other than FDG PET, is there anything else you use in a neurology clinic to help?
So much like everything in clinical medicine is the history. The exam's important too, but the history, and especially in BVFTD, it's the off color. It's the clear change in behavior. That's really the clue that somebody, for example, is at a funeral and making a few jokes or saying people based on their appearance how they look when that's just not appropriate in a social setting. And this can begin just with a few off color comments, and then months seem to be relatively normal, and then a few more. And so, again, it can smolder along. With the language, just because humans are so much more reliant on language for functioning, it's a bit more apparent that I can't get my words out. It's like my tongue is tied, or I just cannot come up with a name of a person or a thing. And often it's that person or that thing is used in place of the appropriate noun.
Yeah, and you were saying, in my limited experience with behavioral variant, is it true that the person just doesn't have the insight into recognizing these changes? And when families report this, they feel like there's no, you're wrong for observing this. I feel totally fine.
Yeah, that is the prototype, and that is largely true. But as we're seeing more and more people early in the illness for a lot, including in BVFTD, insight is, I wouldn't say it's completely preserved, but it's more preserved than not. As the illness progresses, then anosognosia or insight is clearly more affected. And the genetic forms too, especially if they know there's a mutation in the family. And I've met many individuals that I just know I'm different. I'm like my sister. I'm like my father. And otherwise, I feel okay, but I can't come up with the words, or I'm just more emotionally detached with my spouse or with my kids. Comments along those lines.
And I'm sure you get this question a lot when you're out in public. And I don't want to worry our listeners who are experiencing word finding or difficulty naming, something. So I'm going to ask you the question of, what do you say to the person who comes up to you and says, well, I'm struggling to find words here and there. Should I be evaluated for FTD?
I guess the best term in terms of the red flag, so to speak, if something's happening and it's relatively consistent. It may not happen all the time, but being in a social setting and not coming up with a name, or being with a family and what's that person's name? That. But when it's more consistent than not, and then a behavior change, it's more that just family members or friends just say, this is different than this person, and it's not a one-off. It's more than one or two or three comments.
Okay, so now I want to look at after a diagnosis. What does the standard of care look like? Are there medications specific to the disease, or are there referrals that a person should make as a clinician or a patient should go to?
Yeah, this is where an early accurate diagnosis can be very helpful. Unfortunately, we still do not have any FDA approved agents for FTD, for any of the FTD syndromes. We're not including ALS under that umbrella. But so a lot of this is first recognition, and then non-pharmacologic things, education, empowerment, how do we maximize quality of life. Um, then from a pharmacologic standpoint, there was a recent trial published, one of the first trial called the FOXY trial. This was intranasal oxytocin for improving apathy in people with BVFTD. Now, that's not easily available, but now there's evidence supporting its use. Really, the standard of care from any treatment perspective is the SSRI or SNRI class, just because it often will help with anxiety or mood, or there can be a tendency to overeat, or apathy can be prominent. And so it is a bit of a trial and error approach. And there is data from a trial that was done several years ago using trazodone, which we use quite often for insomnia, but this was used at a much higher dose for people with BVFTD, and it was shown to be effective. But without good FDA guidance, and a lot of this is clinical experience, and also, and this is kind of controversial, the standard is not to use a cholinesterase inhibitor like donepezil, ribostigmine, or galantamine. And I think most people in the field agree that one, they're not that helpful, and two, sometimes, almost paradoxically, symptoms can get worse. But an occasional person might have some lift of the apathy. And in my experience, that's the one symptom that sometimes can improve with a cholinesterase inhibitor. Memantine has been studied in a large trial, and it was unfortunately not shown to be efficacious. And so still memantine is often used, but there's no evidence supporting it. So much of this is symptom-based as opposed to disease-based.
And do you have any referrals that people commonly will go to? In Alzheimer's, of course, we do a lot of occupational therapy or speech therapy, counseling. I mean, is there anything in particular with FTLD that's been beneficial?
Yeah, great question. So PPA, absolutely involvement with a speech therapist, and sometimes working with a speech therapist who does have knowledge in the PPA area. The approach as part of the speech therapy plan, it's largely based on the stroke experience, but there are some adaptations that are done because it's rare to get a stroke in the anterior temporal lobe, and therefore the semantic variant of PPA, you don't see that often clinically in vascular disorders. But absolutely, speech therapy can be quite helpful. And then in those who have motor impairment involving occupational therapy and physical therapy, um, in the BVFTD, a psychiatrist can be invariably helpful. There can be some challenges sometimes requiring hospitalization. And as a neurologist or geriatricians, it's often hard, how do I hospitalize and what's the most appropriate service that's going to be most helpful for this individual. So involving a psychiatrist early on is often a good idea too.
And Brad, you know that in Alzheimer's, we do a lot of referrals to the Alzheimer's Association or the Alzheimer's Foundation of America. And I'm involved in both of those. And so, is there an organization in this world that you make a referral to or you connect people to?
Excellent question. The Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, AFTD, every individual that we meet with any of these syndromes we have been talking about, AFTD, they have an excellent website, theaftd.org, and a strong referral network. So that's the organization, basically the equivalent of the Alzheimer's Association. And then depending on other things, for example, cortical basal syndrome or PSP, the Cure PSP organization is an excellent website. It's curepsp.org. They have a lot of resources also for CBS, PSP, and other motor phenotypes in the FTLD. So those are the two most common, and they're both excellent.
And another important referral in care is usually to clinical research, particularly in our field. And so I suspect the same is true for FTLD. And so, can you start by giving us the 30,000-foot view on where we are in FTLD research and then the major advances in the past decade or so?
Yeah, so FTD research was for many, many years embedded in the Alzheimer research networks, especially across the Alzheimer's disease research centers, and that still continues. But an offshoot of that is what the ARTFL-LEFFTDS consortium. And just to explain this, and it's a little bit of a long story, but years ago there was one research proposal, advancement of research and treatment in frontotemporal lobar degeneration. That's artful, and that was focused on sporadic FTLD and to some extent familial FTLD. At the same time, a related group submitted a grant for familial FTD, and that was lefties. Longitudinal evaluation of familial frontotemporal lobar degeneration subjects. And that was then the NIH then thought, well, these are largely overlapping. Why not just make the infrastructure the same, which was a very good idea. So it was combined into ARTFL-LEFFTDS. And that's proceeded for a good 5 years. And then the next phase was ALLFTD, ARTFL-LEFFTDS, longitudinal frontotemporal lobar degeneration, so ALLFTD. And hopefully the next phase of ALLFTD, ALLFTD2, hopefully that will be refunded, that will be funded and will begin as early as the fall. That's what we're hoping for. So, but through that course, we've learned an enormous amount. One is it's important to build the infrastructure. So this started with 8 sites with one grant, 15 in another. Now our ALLFTD is 28 sites in North America, 2 Canadian sites, and the others in the U.S. And we meet regularly, and it's really built into very similar to the ADRC network with 35, 36 centers across the U.S. But the key thing is coalescing on how do we characterize and follow individuals, early and accurate diagnosis, collection of biofluid, so blood and spinal fluid in those who are willing, longitudinal MRI scans, which are going to be the core and have been the core for clinical trials, and PET scans. And this is where, again, we desperately need a ligand that is specific for the forms of tau and for TDP-43. That's what we anticipate is the major breakthroughs over the next 5 years, is these ligands. And we have over 3,000 people we've seen over ARTFL-LEFFDS over the course of 10 years, and we have about 1,600 people who are active. So it's quite a large cohort of individuals. We don't have a blood test yet, really working hard on it. In the spinal fluid, there are some signals in spinal fluid, not there yet to be like we can diagnose Alzheimer's disease with very high accuracy based on spinal fluid or molecular PET. Again, those are the breakthroughs that we really anticipate over the next 3 to 5 years. And just like in Alzheimer's disease, as those breakthroughs happen, that's going to really accelerate therapeutics and trials. We've had many trials. We're going to hear the result of a phase 3 trial in a particular genetic form, progranulin, later this year. And there's several other phase 2 trials in progranulin. There's several focused on tau mutation carriers being planned. Same thing for the C9orf72 gene. There have been some that occurred and more being planned. So the clinical trial landscape, even though these are relatively uncommon, there's a lot of interest by pharma, fortunately, largely because the biology is not fully understood, but in many ways understood, at least to the point where we can identify the target and there's a means to intervene in the target.
And so, why is it so important to have this network of sites working to build this cohort of individuals? Because it seems like all FTD, like you said, is similar to our Alzheimer's Disease Research Center network. And collectively, you just said 3,000 participants. So, why is that so critical?
One is there are, this sounds kind of trite, but there are so many individuals that have similar symptoms and therefore diagnosis is relatively straightforward. We're learning a lot. A lot of people have atypical features and findings. We're finding genetic variants in seemingly sporadic individuals. So that can impact clinical care. So whether it's a suspected or known genetic alteration in a family, or we find a spontaneous mutation in an individual, that opens up potential avenues for clinical trial, but it obviously has implications for biologic relatives. And having 28 sites for all the trials that have been happening and that are being planned, you want a trial network so they know what to do, what the measures are done, the scans, the way that a standard clinical trial is done. Without that infrastructure, it'd be very laborious and expensive for our industry partners to just design and conduct one trial. But there's multiple going on, and again, several more planned.
What have you learned so far from the ALLFTD study? And I know there's a lot of scientific papers that comes out of this group. So if there's just a couple that you wanted to mention for our listeners who might be interested in either participating or just looking further into the study.
Yeah, we've had the good fortune with so many experts in the field. There's been over 500 publications that are directly or indirectly related to ARTFL-LEFFDS, ALLFTD. One of the most notable scientifically, I think a lot would agree, is the families with a mutation in either tau or progranulin or the C9 ORF72. We often abbreviate the C9. The data from those families in ALLFTD and also the data in the sister study in Europe called GenFI. GenFI has been going on longer than ARTFL-LEFFDS, ALLFTD, and they're a fantastic group and a really large cohort too. And the global effort is called the Frontotemporal Dementia Prevention Initiative, FPI. But this was pretty complicated. It was taking all the clinical data, available MRI data, and some biofluid markers to develop a disease progression model using Bayesian statistics. So this gets quite complicated, but we've been able to put together models of this is what tends to happen among those with a MAPT or tau mutation. And it overlaps to some extent, but is different in important ways for progranulin. And same is true for C9. But that's been done on disease modeling using available data. And the true test of any model is obviously testing it prospectively. And so trying to do this with many, many more individuals. But pharma has really jumped on to these models, and they're using this intellectual background as they design trials. And so it's not too hard to see, and it's not to the point of AI applications, but it's kind of a rudimentary AI approach to a complex and relatively uncommon group of disorders.
One of the things that seems very clear, Brad, in talking to you is, we ultimately want to get to treatment. We want to get to ways of helping people, but we really, in order to do that, we have to understand the disease. We have to understand what's causing it, what the course looks like, what you just referred to. And so that just takes a lot of people and a lot of data, and then ideally AI to help us craft it.
Yeah, and that is true. And this has been part of the challenge. So many of our patients and families, and I hear this often, and all of us completely understand. Number one priority, we need the urgency for treatments, including prevention for those who have a mutation but don't have any symptoms. Absolutely, that's priority number one. But in order to get there, you have to understand the natural history of the illness, collect this data to know with biomarkers. And this makes sense when you think about it. If, for example, a person's in their 30s, they have a mutation, and it may or may not be 100% penetrant, meaning they may or may not eventually develop an illness. But if they use the therapy as a prevention, how do you prove that you're delaying or preventing the illness? That's where the biomarkers come in. So you have to find something that's tracking in the asymptomatic phase impacted by an intervention, and that's good evidence. Okay, we're affecting the underlying disease process and thereby preventing or at least delaying the onset. So that's the big challenge. But there's so many families that are very involved, and this isn't fun to do all these tests periodically. It's pretty anxiety provoking, but we know how to get there. It's just a matter of having the funding, which, as we know, that's a whole nother story right now. But acceleration of treatment, that's the goal.
Well, and speaking of which, though, a part of your mission, though, is setting the stage for proper clinical trials. That's what all FTD is helping do. You mentioned a couple of already. There are some treatment trials underway. What types of specific medications do you think are going to be possible in the next 10 years with your understanding of the disease progression?
Yeah. So first, again, coming to the example of Boeve FTD, roughly half have a primary tau problem, roughly half have a TDP. This sounds so basic, but if we have a tau active treatment, we don't necessarily want to use a tau active treatment in somebody who has a TDP disorder, especially if there's toxicity. And so getting better biomarkers to know who has a tau problem versus TDP. And so that's going to be a key from a treatment standpoint. So the biomarker development, but those focus on tau, those focus on TDP, and associated downstream or even perhaps even upstream effects. And we also know inflammation is part of the degenerative process in almost all of these. There's actually one trial going on in semantic variant PPA with an anti-inflammatory agent to see could that impact. But some medicines don't cross the blood-brain barrier very well, and so you have to use it at a dose that doesn't cause any bad systemic side effects. But those, it just makes sense. Just like lecanemab and donanemab now for amyloid and Alzheimer's disease, the tau platform trial being developed for the tau angle of Alzheimer's disease. I just heard over the weekend the PSP tau platform trial that's going forward. So spectrum of tau agents is going to be designed for P2P, for PSP. And what we're learning in PSP and in Alzheimer's disease that relates to tau will have direct implications for tau in FTD also.
Well, so to add today, Brad, what brings you the most hope when you think about the research and the clinical care for those with or at risk of developing FTD?
It's these treatments. I've been around for a few decades, so I remember when I started off thinking, we'll probably have a treatment, truly disease-modifying treatment within the next 5-10 years, and it took, over 20 years, at least over my career, and we've got long ways to go in Alzheimer's disease. But to see all that hard work and then the treatment on amyloid and what we've learned and what we know we still need to do to impact Alzheimer's disease, we're earlier in that same course in FTD, and so I think we've learned a lot, good and not so good, of what agents and how not to do trials, and not to be critical of the history, but everybody's doing their best, and you learn from those experiences. Okay, well, this is not how to do a trial going forward. So that's the excitement, to know that we're going to have treatments for tau, TDP, all of these genetic forms, and the future. And I mean this with all sincerity. I think the future really does look far more optimistic now than even 2-3 years ago.
Well, I want to end on that high note, Brad. So thank you for being on Dementia Matters today, and certainly I hope to have you on in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Nate, and appreciate the opportunity.
As a reminder, continuing education credit is available for this episode through the Interprofessional Continuing Education Partnership at University of Wisconsin-Madison. To claim credit, you can text this code, KOYHUN, at this number, 608-260-7097. Again, the number is 608-260-7097, and text this code, KOYHUN. Your feedback is important to us. To complete an evaluation form for this episode, see the show notes. Thank you for listening to Dementia Matters. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, or tell your smart speaker to play the Dementia Matters podcast. Please rate us on your favorite podcast app. It helps other people find our show and lets us know how we're doing. If you enjoy our show and want to support our work, consider making a gift to the Dementia Matters Fund through the UW Initiative to End Alzheimer's. All donations go toward outreach and production. Donate at the link in the description. Dementia Matters is brought to you by the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It receives funding from private, university, state, and national sources, including a grant from the National Institutes on Aging for Alzheimer's Disease Research. This episode of Dementia Matters was produced by Kaylin Rowerdink and edited by Eli Gadbury. Our musical jingle is Cases to Rest by Blue Dot Sessions. To learn more about the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, check out our website at adrc.wisc.edu. That's adrc.wisc.edu. And follow us on Facebook and Twitter. If you have any questions or comments, email us at dementiamatters@medicine.wisc.edu. Thanks for listening.